First of all, just thank you so much to everyone coming out this evening to the museum. It's really wonderful to see you all here, especially in this beautifully restored ballroom that looks very much as it did when Chester Nimitz came back after the war to visit his hometown for the first time. I want to talk, I'm actually going to move this. It's going to be better for me this way. I want to talk tonight about Japan's road to peace, which might be better termed Japan's convoluted and nearly disastrous road to peace, because there were any number of opportunities along this pathway when war might have been snatched from the jaws of peace, and it is to the credit of both sides that that managed not to happen. First thing I want to do is give you a crash course in Japanese politics, so buckle up. When we get to about July of 1945, Japan is being ruled by this group of individuals. This is the Supreme Council for the Direction of the War, otherwise known as the Big Six. And they are composed of the Prime Minister Suzuki, his Foreign Minister Togo, and then you've got the Army and Navy ministers, Anami and Yonai, and their respective chiefs of staff, Umezu and Toyota. And there's a couple of things to point out about these gentlemen. First of all, Suzuki, even though he's the prime minister, is also an ex-admiral. And Yonai, likewise, has been a prime minister in previous administrations. So you can see that there's not a lot of civilians in this mix. There's only one civilian here, and that's Togo. Arguably, the most important of these six guys is Anami, because by this point in time, the majority of the Japanese Navy has been destroyed, which means that the political capital of the Navy in Japan is no longer what it used to be. And in terms of hard power on the ground, the Army has it in spades, because they have millions of boots, in Japan. The other two people that matter, of course, in Japan are the Emperor, Hirohito, and his gatekeeper, Lord Privy Seal Kido. And you can think about the relationship of these two guys. Kido is almost the emperor's spirit animal, in that he is one of Hirohito's few genuine friends, and Hirohito trusts Kido implicitly to always congruently convey his intentions and wishes to his ministers. And likewise, that means that Kido has a lot of pull with the emperor, because you can think about, their strategic outlooks are really, two sides of the same coin almost. It's almost the same relationship that FDR had with Admiral William Leahy. They're just absolutely simpatico. So there's some kind of quirky ways that these 8 individuals have got to work together. Among other things, the unspoken rule is that the Big Six has to bring unanimous decisions to the emperor to be authorized. And that if the Big Six gets into some sort of a deadlock, they've got to either hash it out until they do come to agreement, or the government collapses. Okay, so that's thing number one. The second thing is that the military has a power of monopoly, or really veto power, over the formation of civilian governments, in that the Meiji Constitution stipulates that all cabinets must have an Army and a Navy minister, and that those must be serving military officers. And so, if the military doesn't like the way that a government is going, all they have to do is have their guy resign, and the government falls apart. Next thing is that the emperor himself has no direct ability to influence policy. He is a constitutional monarch. He presides over this group of ministers, but he does not direct them. He can obliquely affect matters by asking questions that may give these ministers clues as to what the emperor is thinking about, but he's not allowed to come out and just say, I want this or I want that. It's, again, very indirect how things have to happen here. So, as you can see, it's a fairly interesting political environment these people are having to operate in. If you lay these guys out on a spectrum of where they fall in terms of we're going to surrender to we're not going to surrender, what you see is we got 3 hardliners led by Anami, who are of the opinion that Japan should never surrender. In fact, Anami has made public pronouncements that it would be preferable for every man, woman, and child in Japan to die before we give up to the Allies. That's how hardcore he is. A little bit to the left, you have Suzuki, the Emperor, and Kido, who are of the opinion that, okay, we probably lost the war, but what we need to do is come up with one last major victory over the Americans, which will improve our bargaining position so that if we go into a negotiation with the Americans, we're going to get something of a better deal than what we're being offered right now, which is unconditional surrender. That's what's on the table, right? And then the peace camp is represented by Yonai and Togo. Togo is the only individual here who thinks that they should start negotiating with the Americans right now. But you can see that at this point in time, the middle of July, the peace camp has got a pretty weak hand to be playing. The Big Six are banking on two things. The first is what's known as Operation Ketsugo. They understand that the Americans are going to be invading Japan, most likely, and that the most likely place where that's going to happen is going to be in the southern island of Kyushu. And so, as a result of that, they have been furiously pumping troops into Kyushu for the last 7 months. By the time we get to the middle of July, they have put nearly 1 million soldiers in Kyushu, over 10,000 aircraft, and are awaiting the American invasion. And the Army is confident that they are going to be able to kick us back into the water. The second thing, though, they're hedging their bets, and they're hoping to use Moscow and use the Soviets as an intermediary to potentially negotiate a peace. And so to that end, what they want to do is they want to send this gentleman out to Moscow as a special envoy, Prince Konoe Fumimaro. Konoe is a big shot. Konoe has been a prime minister 3 separate times, actually. He comes from a house that is damn near as noble as the emperor's house, okay? So he's a big force in Japan. So they want to send him out to Moscow. And this creates problems for Japan's ambassador in Moscow, a guy named Sato. Sato, likewise, is a very senior, experienced hand. He, too, has been a foreign minister in previous administrations. And when he starts getting communiques from his boss, Togo, that I want you to, make it happen that we can send Konoe out to Moscow, Sato goes back to them and is like, okay, guys, I can't very well just walk into Molotov's office and say, hey, I want to send Konoe out here. Are you cool with having him come visit? Molotov is going to want to have a term sheet from us. Where is our initial bargaining position to actually end this war? And the problem for Togo, of course, is that he can't give him one, because the Big Six can't even come to internal agreement at this point as to any conditions that they would be willing to terminate the war. So every time that Sato goes back to Togo and says, what's our term sheet, Togo kind of hand waves around this. And finally, what ends up happening is that on 18 July, Sato sends a cable back to Tokyo, and he says, in pretty blunt terms, you guys are being completely unrealistic. The very best deal we are going to get to end this war is going to be unconditional surrender, possibly modified by the retention of the imperial system, okay? That's what we're going to get out of this thing. And a few days later, Togo cables him back and says, with regard to unconditional surrender, we are unable to consent to it under any circumstances whatsoever. I point this out for 3 reasons. First is, the Americans are reading all of this. We have broken Japan's diplomatic codes years ago, and by this point in the war, we have thousands of analysts who are working this intel channel, and in some cases, we are reading these messages more quickly than Sato and Togo are, okay? So there's been a persistent myth down through the years that, oh, we really didn't need to drop the bomb on the Japanese because the Japanese were just about ready to throw in the towel, and if we had just offered them that they could keep the emperor, they would have thrown in the towel. But this series of, transmissions back and forth is contemporaneous evidence that that is just not the case. They were nowhere near wanting to throw in the towel. Because you'll notice that Sato is predicting precisely the terms that the Japanese will end up accepting a month from now, and yet those are totally unacceptable to Togo at this point in time. All right. So just a few days later, the Potsdam conference happens outside of Berlin, and that is Stalin and Churchill, soon to be replaced, and also Truman. And Truman starts getting a lot of heat from the other allies that, like, look, you really need to articulate to the Japanese what it is that the post-war Japan is going to look like. What does unconditional surrender really mean to us, and what is it that we are hoping to achieve with that? And so as a result of that, we come out with what is known as the Potsdam Declaration on the 26th of July. And it starts out with a very sternly worded missive. Following are our terms, we will not deviate from them. There are no alternatives. We shall brook no delay. And the four linchpins of this declaration are: 1, Japan is going to be occupied by the Allied powers. 2, you are going to be completely disarmed. 3, there will be war crimes trials. And 4, we are going to remake your government into a liberal democracy where the final form of the Japanese government is going to be determined by the Japanese people. Okay? So we send that off. We don't really send it to the Japanese, we just broadcast it. You know, here are the terms. And the alternative, if you don't take these terms, is prompt and utter destruction. So that goes over real well in Japan, and you can imagine that the hardliners in particular are just thrilled by that. And under pressure from the hardliners, Suzuki then has to come out with an official statement, and it is this, that the government will ignore it. And he uses the word mokusatsu, which can be translated a number of different ways, and I'm looking at my Japanese linguist here in the audience. I think the easiest way to think of mokusatsu is talk to the hand. That's really what it comes down to. You know, we will ignore with silence. So at this point, with the Americans basically having had their terms rejected, we are now in a position where we have to make good on our threats, and we do. So on 6 August 1945 at 08:16 in the morning, Enola Gay flies over Hiroshima and drops Little Boy and obliterates Hiroshima. And we will never know the exact toll that took. It's between 70 and 90,000 killed outright, including 20,000 military personnel, because Hiroshima is the headquarters of 2nd General Army, which is the army headquarters that is in charge of Ketsugo, that operation. Between 69,000 and 150,000 injured, and as I say, the city it's just absolutely leveled. We get word in Tokyo of that relatively quickly because there's a large naval base very close to Hiroshima at Kure. They send a message at 08:30 that, you know, Hiroshima has been bombed with an extremely destructive bomb. And later on that afternoon, the Japanese are going to send an official delegation down to Hiroshima to figure out what is going on down there. Truman now gets on the air and says exactly what has happened, that we have an atomic weapon and we have used it. And if Japan's leaders do not now accept our terms, they may expect a rain of ruin from the air, the like of which has never been seen on Earth. It brings us to 8 August. That morning, word comes back from this gentleman, Nishina Yoshio, who is Japan's foremost nuclear physicist. And he's part of this delegation that has been sent down to Hiroshima. And he wires back that, in fact, yes, the city has been destroyed by a single atomic bomb. And the Japanese understand what an atomic bomb is. They had their own bomb program, of course. But to have it verified, that's a bit of an eye-opener for them. And that brings us then to morning in the Imperial Palace. And this is a lovely shot. And I bring this up because at this point in time, Hirohito is spending most of his waking hours in a bomb shelter. And when we talk about bunker mentalities, I mean, this is a man who is actually living in a bunker mentality, right? And we've only recently gotten some photographs within the last few years from the Japanese household ministry as to what that bunker looks like now. This is the actual state of the conference room that Hirohito spends a lot of his time in during these days. But there's a fear in Tokyo that there will be an atomic attack there, of course, and he does not want to be part of that. So that's where he's living a lot of the time. In any case, Togo comes to the palace at 10 in the morning to give his report to both Kido and Hirohito that, in fact, Hiroshima has been destroyed by an atomic weapon. And Kido lets Togo know that now would be a very good time to bring this war to a close, that the advent of atomic weapons really changes things. And the next quote I want to give you is just evidence that the scholarship on this series of events continues to evolve, in that it is only within the last 3 or 4 months that the diary of Foreign Minister Togo has actually been released to Japanese scholars. And a couple of my American friends that live in Japan actually sent me some of this stuff, so this is hot off the press. When Togo makes his report, the emperor makes this comment, that if they have an atomic bomb, war at the water's edge is impossible, even if the Allied conditions are such that it will take 300 years for us to recover. Accepting their conditions cannot be helped. In other words, Hirohito immediately grasps that the advent of atomic weapons negates any ability for Ketsugo to work. Because if the Americans have got a bomb, they can drop it on our troops just as easily as they can drop it on a city. And so there's no ability now for us to really make Ketsugo work. Hirohito is a militarily trained guy. He was given a military education as part of his upbringing. And throughout the war, he has asked very shrewd, perceptive questions of his military advisors. And here's another example of that. So Hirohito understands right now, on August 8th, before the Soviets are going to invade, that the jig is up, right? And I present this as another piece of evidence because there's been an ongoing debate between scholars as to which is more important, the Soviet invasion or the dropping of the bombs in terms of bringing the Japanese to accepting surrender. I'm strongly in the bomb camp, spoiler alert, and I think that this quote here adds yet more evidence to that fact that on August 8th, the emperor knows it's over. That evening, at about 11 p.m. Tokyo time, which is 5 p.m. Moscow time, Ambassador Sato is shown into the office of Foreign Minister Molotov and is handed a letter saying, "We declare war on you," effective in about 60 minutes. Sorry, not sorry. And so that's a real eye-opener for the Japanese as well. Of course, it's now midnight in Tokyo, but shortly after midnight, on 9 August, the Red Army unleashes their juggernaut. It is a classic double envelopment that is going to be aimed at congealing down at the town of Mukden. And the real haymaker of this operation is actually that western series of armies out there in Mongolia, because among other things, the 6th Guards Tank Army is out there. But the thing to remember about this is that that left wing is so far out in the boonies in Mongolia that the Japanese will not even realize that that attack is underway for another 2 days. There's heavy combat happening in eastern Manchuria, but the Japanese will not be aware of the western haymaker for another couple of days. This is a real military mismatch, too, because the Kwantung Army used to be the foremost army in the Imperial Army as a whole. But the intervening years have hollowed it out in that a lot of its elite formations have been peeled out and sent off to places in the Pacific where they've been either bypassed or annihilated. And those formations have been backfilled with older, less well-trained reservists in many cases. They've got about 1,200 armored fighting vehicles of pretty questionable quality, around 1,000 aircraft, but only 200 of them were combat types. Meanwhile, the Russians are going to be using 1.6 million soldiers, 28,000 artillery pieces and rocket launchers, 5,500 very formidable armored fighting vehicles and self-propelled guns, and over 3,700 planes. So this is just a sledgehammer aimed at the Kwantung Army. There's no way they're going to be able to stand up to this. So word of that arrives in Tokyo at about 0400. And that is the news that greets Togo when he rolls out of bed that next morning very early and immediately goes over to Suzuki's house and says to the prime minister, "This is it. We need to end the war like today." Suzuki is more ambivalent. He's like, "I need to hear what the emperor's opinion on this matter is." And sure enough, later on that morning, Suzuki rolls into the palace and is told by Kido, now would be a really good time to stop the war. But it's not that simple, of course, because now Suzuki has got to go to a meeting of the Big Six, and they got to hash this out. What are we going to do? And the result of that meeting is going to be Well, that first of all, the news of Nagasaki rolls in. So that happens in the middle of the meeting. And again, we will never know the results in terms of the actual body count at Nagasaki. It's somewhere between 24 and 45,000 people killed, another 25 to 60,000 injured. But the initial reports back to Tokyo are that this is a less powerful weapon than the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. And that is true because Sweeney, the guy who was piloting Boxcar, frankly botched that mission and dropped the bomb far away from, the downtown area. In any case, by the end of that meeting at 1300, they've split down the middle yet again. And so we have what you might call the one condition camp and the four condition camp. The one condition camp, the peace camp, is saying, okay, we will accept the Potsdam Declaration with the proviso that the emperor be retained. The four condition camp is like, yeah, we want that. Also, there will be no physical occupation of Japan. We'll conduct our own war crimes trials, and we will disarm ourselves. And and you can imagine how that would go over with the Allies, but we'll get to that in just a little bit. So they're split down the middle. And again, that means that they've either got to figure this out or the government is going to collapse, right? So after that meeting is going on, and actually still during the meeting, Konoe shows up at the palace and huddles up with Kido. Konoe at this point is very much in the peace camp and understands that we need to get this thing over with as quickly as possible, and he lets Kido know that. Half an hour later, Suzuki rolls in and says, we can't come to an agreement. And because we can't come to an agreement, I'm probably in a position where we're going to have to endorse the four conditions camp because that's the lowest common denominator sort of decision that we can make. Kido is not happy about this. He records in his diary, well, I guess that's the government and it can't be helped, but he thinks that this is not necessarily a good thing. At that point, Suzuki now goes back to a meeting of the full cabinet that is going to run for the next 5.5 hours while they try to hash it out. While that is going on, Konoe has gotten wind of the fact that we've got this deadlock between one condition and four conditions. And Konoe understands this is going to be a disaster for us if we try to push four conditions. That if we do that, the Allies are going to essentially say we are rejecting the Potsdam Declaration, and the next time around, there aren't going to be any conditions at all. We're going to get the deal that Germany got, which was nothing. So Konoe phones Kido and says, you've got to do everything you can to make sure that the four-condition camp gets quashed. And not only that, but Konoe has also reached out to other powerful individuals within Japan, including Prince Takamatsu, who is one of Hirohito's younger brothers, and Takamatsu says exactly the same thing. He also reaches out to another former foreign minister, Shigemitsu, and Shigemitsu likewise is like, four condition, no good. So Kido is getting this constant stream of phone calls, and we know too that he meets with the emperor not once but twice during this afternoon. And of course, he cannot help but have relayed those opinions back to the emperor. About 2200, Suzuki and Togo come back to the palace and they say, we're still split down the middle, even in the full cabinet. Can't come to a decision. And again, everyone understands that that means that the government is going to collapse. The situation is so dire at this point that everyone understands that we just can't have that happen. And so Suzuki takes this opportunity to then ask the emperor, would you be willing to have an imperial conference this very night, and we would like to ask your opinion, which is absolutely unprecedented because, again, the emperor has no direct ability to impart his opinion. But the emperor understands, again, the gravity of the situation. He nods, he gets up, and he leaves. And that sets the stage for what is known as the Seidan, the sacred decision. So 10 minutes before midnight, in the bomb shelter, the Big Six comes in along with a number of other bigwigs and their senior advisors. And first, Suzuki gets up and recounts the events of the day as if the emperor didn't actually know what's been happening all day long. And then Togo and Yonai get up. The pro-peace camp kind of lays out why it is that we should accept one condition. The counterattack is then mounted by Anami, Umezu, and finally Toyota as to why we can't accept that and it must be four conditions. And at that point, Suzuki then gets up and asks the emperor, we are at deadlock. We cannot come to a decision. What is the emperor's decision? And he uses the word decision, which again is unprecedented. He is not asking for an opinion. He wants the emperor's decision. As soon as he says that, without the slightest bit of hesitation, Hirohito rises to his feet, and the other ministers scramble, to follow suit. And Hirohito says, I have given serious thought to the situation and have concluded that continuing the war can only mean destruction for the nation. He then follows that up with an absolutely withering critique of the military camp. He says, there are those who say that the key to national survival lies in a decisive battle in the homeland. The experiences of the past, however, show that there has always been a discrepancy between plans and performance. Okay, and this is in very courtly language, but he's basically chucked a spear through the heart of Anami and Umezu. He's basically saying, you have failed me. I have lost trust in the army, and he is intentionally shaming his military men in the eyes of these other senior bigwigs. And that therefore, the time has come when we must bear the unbearable. And at that point, he walks out of the room. So you want to talk about a mic drop moment. He's not allowing any debate. And as soon as he exits, Suzuki then says, the decision of the emperor should therefore be the decision of the full cabinet. And there's an emergency cabinet meeting at about 2 in the morning, and by 3 a.m. they have universally ratified the opinion of the emperor. So now, the emperor having made his decision known and the cabinet having ratified that decision, we should be prepared for a swift and straightforward termination of this war, right? Oh, you sweet summer child. So the first thing that's got to happen is figure out whether the Americans are actually going to accept this one condition. And that leads to a meeting in the Oval Office between Truman and his senior advisors. We got Secretary of War Stimson, Secretary of the Navy Forrestal, Secretary of State Burns, and William Lee, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they go around and around, but it's eventually Forrestal that comes up with the weasel words that are going to be used in our response, which becomes known as the Burns Note. And the Burns Note notes, very famously, that from the moment of surrender, the authority of the emperor shall be subject to the supreme commander of the Allied powers, who will take such steps as he deems proper to effectuate the surrender terms, which means that, yes, the emperor will be on the throne, however, there will be, in essence, a shogun, an American shogun in the person of MacArthur, and it's MacArthur who was calling the shots here. So you can rule all you want as long as I think it's fine. That is what ends up going back to the Japanese. Understand, too, that there are time zone differences that are, adding to the disjointedness of this. But anyway, brings us to 12 August. While the Japanese are waiting for the Americans to come up with their response, Hirohito is making sure to shore up his own political position within Tokyo. Because among other things, he's got 3 younger brothers, 2 of whom, Takamatsu and Chichibu, he doesn't necessarily get along with on a consistent basis. And he understands that any of these 3 gentlemen could be the figurehead that the military puts on the throne if they do a coup and depose him. Chichibu is sort of out of the mix because he's got tuberculosis and he's off convalescing near Mount Fuji, so I don't have to worry about him. But Hirohito brings Takamatsu and Mikasa into the palace and explicitly says, I have lost faith in the army and I need you guys to get in line. And both of them say, very willingly in the case of Takamatsu, we're with you. We understand why it is that you are throwing in the towel at this point. The other thing that happens is that Yonai makes a very interesting observation. He says that the atomic bombs and the Soviet entry into the war are, in a sense, gifts from the gods. Tenyu is the word. And what he's alluding to here is that he's concerned, along with the emperor, about what is known as the domestic situation, that they feel that there is a direct threat from the Japanese population, given the firebombing, given looming famine, and just war sickness in general, that there might be a popular uprising that would not only depose Hirohito, but would do away with the entire imperial system, and they are very concerned about that. What the bomb and the Soviets do is give us a face-saving out. Now that we can say we're throwing in the towel against this technological terror that we just cannot compete against. And I think that's a very perceptive observation on the part of you and I. It brings us to 13 August. The Burns note comes back. That, of course, precipitates a meeting of the Big Six as to whether they're willing to accept the creation of an American shogun in Japan, and predictably enough, it divides right down the middle between the peace camp and the war camp as to whether they're willing to accept that or not. And that brings us then to the second Seidan, the second imperial decision. Because what ends up happening overnight, the Americans are concerned that they haven't heard from the Japanese now for several days. What's going on here? And of course, we're still reading the diplomatic mail. We know there's a lot of messages going back and forth around to the military. It doesn't look like the military is willing to throw in the towel. So on the 14th, Truman says, take the gloves back off. Start the bombing campaign back up again. So the B-29s take off and they start bombing Japanese cities, but the other thing they're dropping is leaflets. They drop millions of leaflets, which basically reprise the fact that we have made an offer to the Japanese government. Your government has accepted the Potsdam Declaration with one proviso. Here's been our response in the Burns note. They are ripping the veil of secrecy off of these internal government deliberations. One of these leaflets ends up, a number of them actually, end up getting dropped over the Imperial Palace. Okay, bummer. And Kido actually is fearful of a coup as well and has been living on the palace grounds for a number of days. And as soon as he gets one of these leaflets in his hands, he understands the jig is up. You know, we gotta cut a deal and we gotta do it now. And he then gets Suzuki into the palace. They meet with the emperor, and the emperor says, we're gonna have a second council, and I want all the senior military guys here for that council as well. And that's what ends up happening just a couple hours later. The first thing he does is the emperor sits down with his senior military men. So we've got Anami, we've got Umezu, we've got a number of other bigwigs. And again, Anami and Umezu lay out the reasons why it is that we are not yet beaten, that we should hold out for better terms, that we should, you know, let the Americans come at us, and we're going to beat off this invasion, and we're going to, you know, kick them back into the sea and get a better deal out of this. And then the haymaker stands up. This gentleman, Field Marshal Hata Shunroku. Hata should have been killed in Hiroshima. He is the commander-in-chief of 2nd General Army. He is the man in charge of Ketsugo. And both Anami and Umezu are looking to him to be the guy that is going to bolster the spirits of the emperor and tell him to keep on fighting, and he does exactly the opposite. He comes in and tells the assembled military officers, I have no confidence of repulsing an enemy landing, which again is just a knife through the heart of Anami and Umezu. And at that point, the emperor then tells his senior military men, I need you to support me in my decision, which is tantamount to an order at that point. That is followed immediately by the Second Imperial Conference. Anami and Umezu make a final desperate effort to, you know, present their case for why we should continue fighting. The pro-peace camp says, no, we should not. And at that point, the emperor is asked for his opinion for a second time, at which point he stands up and says, I have listened carefully to each of the arguments presented in opposition to surrender, but my own thoughts have not undergone any change. I consider the Burns note to be acceptable. And at that point, we've had another mic drop. He then tells his staffers, I want you to prepare an imperial rescript. I am going to read it to the Japanese people tomorrow. And at that point, NHK sends over a team of technicians because they're actually going to cut a physical piece of vinyl, 2 of them in fact, that they're going to play at the NHK radio station at noon on the 15th. So that team is going over there. Anami and the other bigwigs then end up back at the Army Ministry. And of course, Anami at this point is running on like 3 hours sleep at best. And he has a number of interesting conversations when he makes it back. First thing he asks, he talks to Umezu and says, do you think it is advisable to continue the war even at the risk of launching a coup. And Umezu says it is absolutely impossible. The emperor has made his decision plain to us, and the army must support him. And that leads to an impromptu meeting of really the 6 most important men in the army. You've got Anami, Umezu, Doihara, who's the inspector general. You've got, again, Field Marshal Hata, another bigwig Field Marshal Sugiyama, and then Kawabe, who's the vice army minister. And there's a lot of awkward silences in the course of that meeting, but at the end of it, they all end up affixing their personal signatures and their personal seals to a letter that says, the army will act in accordance with the imperial decision to the last. So at this point, you would think that the army is now finally lined up behind the emperor, except Japan at this point has a long, bloody history of insubordination by its junior officers, particularly in the army. In fact, Suzuki still has a bullet in his body from a failed assassination attempt by another group of junior officers, and sure as heck, that afternoon, this gentleman, Major Hatanaka Kenji, who's in the Ministry of Military Affairs, gets word of the fact that there is an imperial rescript coming tomorrow, and they are cutting a recording of the emperor even as we speak. And so he determines that he is going to act, and he has a small group of conspirators with him, and they're panicked at this point. They know they've got only an evening to get this done before that surrender broadcast. So the first thing they do is they go to the home of Lieutenant General Mori Takeshi, who is the commander of the Imperial Guards Division, which is the actual guard unit around the emperor. And they urge him to join the coup. And Mori refuses, and they shoot him dead. And they take his personal seals, and they also have the personal seals of a colonel who's relatively close to Anami, which is a fascinating little factoid. And with Mori and his seals in hand, they forge faked orders that then sends a battalion of the Imperial Guards onto the palace grounds in the middle of the night, and these guys are looking for those recordings. They're also looking for the emperor. They're also looking for Kido. The problem for them is that the Imperial Palace is huge. It's 280 acres worth of compound sitting in the middle of Tokyo, and it's the middle of the night, and they're not familiar with the layout of the palace, and the result is that they just can't find these recordings. The emperor is aware of what is going on. He is watching some of this unfolding through the armored visors in his personal quarters. Kido is hiding out in a bunker underneath the treasury at this point, so it's a relatively touch-and-go kind of time. Which brings us then to the wee hours of 15 August. 2 or 3 in the morning, maybe 4, this gentleman, Tanaka Shizuichi, who is the head of the Eastern Area Army, which oversees the Imperial Guards, and he is also a former commander of the Imperial Guards himself, gets wind of the fact that there's a coup going on at the palace. He piles into a car, races over there, and is determined to shut this coup down or die trying. He finds Hatanaka and the other conspirators, and he rips them a new one, and basically says, get out of here. And he succeeds in his aim. He gets the troops out of the Imperial Palace and is able to report to the emperor at 0800, the coast is clear. Everything is fine, the situation is under control, you're good. Hatanaka and his group goes over to NHK. They try to take over the studio. They are unsuccessful. And eventually they end up back in front of the Imperial Palace, and they kill themselves. Anami likewise kills himself at about 11 a.m. before the surrender broadcast because he does not want to have to hear it. And after he is dead, it is discovered that he leaves behind him 2 scrolls. And on those scrolls, one of them says, believing firmly that our sacred land will never perish, I, with my death, humbly apologize to the emperor for the great crime, which is kind of ambiguously worded. Don't know what the great crime is, but given the fact that one of his aides had his personal chop on those forged orders, it would seem that Anami might have had a hand in this, and certainly some of the Japanese historians who have looked at this likewise would conclude that this coup was not the fleeting dream of a few young officers, but a plan in which some central figures in the Army were participants. And of course, there is no figure more central than Anami. That brings us then to noon. And this is the first time that many of the Japanese people have heard the voice of the emperor. And the recording quality is terrible, and the radio transmissions are likewise pretty bad. And furthermore, the emperor is speaking in this incredibly arcane, courtly version of Nihongo, which makes it practically impossible for the Japanese to understand. And the takeaway line that I'm particularly fond of is that the emperor says that the war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, which is probably the understatement of the century. But nevertheless, it becomes clear in the course of this broadcast that we have lost and we are surrendering, which leads to numerous scenes of bewilderment, in some cases outrage on the part of the Japanese people, but I'm sure in the hearts of many of them a sense of relief that this thing is now over. In contrast, of course, with the pictures of jubilation on the other side of the pond, as we realize that this war that has killed between 60 and 75 million people is now finally over. Thank you so much for your attention.